23 years ago in Echo Park, Los Angeles, the remains of a homeless man were found meticulously arranged in an abandoned movie theater, surrounded by cryptic newspaper clippings and strange symbols drawn in charcoal. Police suspected a ritualistic killing tied to local gang activity or occult practices. With no identification, minimal forensic evidence, and witnesses too afraid to speak, the investigation stalled within months. Yet over the years, one determined detective refused to let go, convinced that the theatrical staging of the body held a message still undeciphered. Then, when digital archive technology and advanced forensic linguistics were applied, a detail overlooked for nearly 2 decades unexpectedly opened a new lead, transforming the entire case and leaving the Los Angeles arts community stunned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In June 1999, summer heat draped over Los Angeles like a heavy blanket, the air thick with smog and the persistent hum of traffic. The once glamorous Echo Park district still clung to remnants of old Hollywood charm, but decay had set in, with abandoned buildings standing as hollow monuments to better days. Among them was the Starlight Theater, a 1930s Art Deco masterpiece that had fallen into disrepair after closing its doors in the early 1990s. On the morning of June 17, a maintenance worker contracted by the city to assess condemned buildings for demolition made his way through the theater's side entrance. Ducking under loose boards that blocked the doorway, he stepped into the musty darkness, the beam from his flashlight cutting through years of dust and cobwebs. The ornate ceiling, once adorned with stars that lit up during screenings, now peeled and crumbled. As his flashlight beam swept across the main screening room, it caught something unusual on the stage. What initially appeared to be an elaborate art installation came into horrifying focus, a human body, propped upright in a wooden chair. The worker's breath caught, his hand trembling as the beam illuminated the scene more clearly. The body, that of an older man, was positioned as if watching the empty theater. Around him, newspaper clippings had been meticulously arranged in concentric circles. Strange symbols had been drawn on the floor with charcoal, and placed in the man's lap was an old film canister, its metal surface polished to a shine that seemed out of place among the dust and decay. Backing away slowly, the worker fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. His voice cracked as he reported what he'd found, struggling to articulate the bizarre tableau before him. Within minutes, sirens pierced the morning quiet, and the flashing red and blue lights of LAPD patrol cars reflected off the Starlight's weathered facade. Officers secured the perimeter, stretching yellow crime scene tape across the theater entrance. Detectives arrived, stepping carefully through the dilapidated lobby, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The first detective on scene, Maria Velasquez, a veteran homicide investigator with 15 years on the force, approached the stage with measured steps, taking in every detail. The victim sat in what appeared to be a director's chair, hands placed deliberately on the armrests. He wore a threadbare coat despite the summer heat, his gray beard long and unkempt. He had no visible wounds at first glance, no signs of struggle. The body had begun to decompose, indicating he'd been dead for at least several days. "This isn't random," Velasquez murmured to her partner, Detective James Reeves. "This was staged with purpose." She pointed to the newspaper clippings arranged around the body. All appeared to be reviews of films from decades past, some yellowed with age, others seemingly more recent. The charcoal symbols resembled nothing she recognized, not gang tags, not religious iconography, but something deliberate and precise. Forensics teams photographed every angle of the scene, the camera flashes illuminating the theater in bursts of stark white light. The medical examiner arrived, Dr. Layla Patel, known for her meticulous work and unflappable demeanor. She examined the body without disturbing its position, noting the lack of obvious trauma. "No gunshot wounds, no stab marks," she reported, her voice echoing in the theater. "But I'm seeing possible signs of poisoning, the slight bluish tint to the fingernails, the discoloration around the mouth." She carefully lifted one of the man's hands. "Rigor has come and gone. He's been here at least 3 days, possibly longer given the ambient temperature." The film canister in the victim's lap was sealed with what appeared to be wax, a detail that struck Velasquez as particularly bizarre. She instructed the evidence technicians to handle it with extreme care. "This wasn't placed here by accident," she said. "Whatever's inside might tell us why someone arranged all this." As the body was finally moved onto a gurney, investigators discovered more newspaper clippings hidden beneath it, these ones with certain words circled in red ink. The floor underneath revealed another surprise, a faded film poster for The Final Scene, a noir thriller from the 1950s that had famously flopped and ruined its director's career. Outside, a crowd had gathered behind the police line, residents and passers-by drawn by the commotion. Among them, Velasquez noticed a young woman watching intently, her expression more studied than shocked. When their eyes met, the woman turned away quickly and disappeared into the crowd. Back at the precinct, the investigation's first hurdle became immediately apparent, identifying the victim. The man carried no ID, his fingerprints weren't in any database, and his clothing provided no meaningful clues. Detective Velasquez pinned up photos of the scene on the department's case board, the strange tableau now the center of attention. "Our John Doe was deliberately placed in that theater," she told the assembled team. "The staging, the newspaper clippings, the film canister, this isn't a typical homicide. It's a message." She tapped a photo of the charcoal symbols. "We need to figure out what these mean and who they were meant for." Forensics reported that the film canister contained an old 8mm film reel, but it was blank, completely unexposed. The wax seal bore a thumbprint that didn't match the victim's. Another dead end, or another clue? The newspaper clippings span decades, from the 1950s to the 1990s, all film reviews, many focusing on directors who had fallen from grace. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed poisoning as the cause of death, specifically, a lethal dose of digitalis, a heart medication derived from foxglove. The poison had been administered in a single large dose, likely in liquid form. The time of death was estimated at 3 to 5 days before discovery. "This wasn't a random killing," Reeves said, studying the photos. "Someone chose this victim, this location, and arranged everything. With purpose. The question is, why make it so theatrical if you're not trying to send a message?" As weeks passed, the investigation hit one wall after another. The homeless community around Echo Park was questioned, but fear kept most silent. Those who did speak mentioned a man they called the Professor who matched their John Doe's description, an older homeless man who often spoke about classic films and sometimes quoted Shakespeare. He kept to himself, appearing in the area about 2 years earlier with no explanation of his past. Velasquez and Reeves canvassed local shelters with photos of the victim. At the Echo Park Community Outreach Center, a volunteer recognized him. "He came in for meals sometimes," she said. "Always polite, always clean compared to others on the street. He signed in as Thomas, never gave a last name. Said he used to work in movies, but most of them say things like that around here." The film canister yielded no fingerprints other than the single one on the wax seal, which remained unidentified. The symbols drawn in charcoal were analyzed by experts in gang iconography, religious studies, and ancient languages, but no clear meaning emerged. Some suggested they might be a personal code or modified film editing notations. By August, the case had stalled completely. Media interest, initially sparked by the bizarre staging, waned as more sensational crimes demanded attention. The department, stretched thin as always, began to shift resources elsewhere. Only Velasquez remained fixated, often staying late to stare at the case board, convinced they were missing something fundamental. "The whole scene was like something from a movie," she told Reeves one evening as they reviewed the file. "What if that's exactly what it was? What if our killer was recreating a scene from a film?" This new angle led them to film archives and old movie databases, searching for parallels to the Starlight Theater scene. Nothing matched exactly, but certain elements, the director's chair, the concentric circles, the protagonist watching an empty theater, appeared in obscure art films and experimental cinema from the 1960s and 70s. Their John Doe, now officially designated as the Professor in department files, remained unidentified as summer turned to fall. His body, unclaimed, was eventually buried in a county plot, a small ceremony attended only by Velasquez, Reeves, and a handful of homeless individuals who remembered him from Echo Park. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In November 1999, the case took an unexpected turn. A fire at a storage facility in North Hollywood uncovered a cache of old film equipment, personal journals, and newspaper clippings similar to those found at the Starlight scene. The storage unit had been rented under the name Thomas Harrington, paid annually in cash since 1993. Among the items recovered was an old industry directory from 1975 listing a Thomas Harrington as a promising assistant director who had worked with several notable filmmakers. A photograph in one journal showed a much younger version of their victim standing alongside a famous director on a film set. He wasn't just homeless, Velasquez realized. He had a past in the industry, just like he told people. She pored over the journals, finding increasingly paranoid writings about being erased from the credits and written out of film history. The most recent entries, dated just months before his death, mentioned someone finally reaching out and recognition at last. The discovery should have reinvigorated the investigation, but department priorities had shifted. A series of gang-related shootings demanded immediate attention, and the nearly 6-month-old theater case was officially designated cold, despite Velasquez's protests. "This man's killer is out there, possibly planning another scene," she argued to her captain. The storage unit proves he had connections to the film industry. Someone from his past targeted him. "Detective, we have active cases with living victims at risk," Captain Daniels responded. "I understand your frustration, but unless something new breaks, I can't justify dedicating resources to this case." Reluctantly, Velasquez boxed up the evidence and case notes. Before filing them away in the cold case storage, she made personal copies of key documents and photos. The Starlight Theater murder had gotten under her skin in a way few cases ever had, not just for its bizarreness, but for the deliberate artistry of it. Someone had turned a man's death into a performance, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the audience was still out there, waiting for the next act. As 2000 arrived with Millennium celebrations across Los Angeles, the Starlight case was officially one of many unsolved homicides in a city that generated them with disturbing regularity. The theater itself was demolished that spring, erasing the physical space where the macabre scene had been staged. Yet the case continued to haunt Velasquez, who found herself driving past the now empty lot on her way home, as if the answers might somehow materialize from the vacant space. In the years that followed, she would occasionally pull out her copies of the case files, reviewing them for anything missed, any connection overlooked. She attended retrospective film festivals, especially those featuring work from the 1970s, studying attendees' faces, wondering if the killer might return to the scene, not of the crime, but of the artistic world that seemed to have inspired it. By 2004, Velasquez had been promoted to lieutenant and moved to a different division, her daily work far removed from the Starlight case. The department had evolved, new technologies had emerged, and younger detectives talked about cold cases from the late 90s as if they were ancient history. But for Velasquez, the image of the professor, staged like an actor in his final role, remained vivid. That year, the department instituted a digital archiving initiative, scanning old case files into a searchable database. During the process, a junior detective noticed similarities between the Starlight Theater case and another unsolved homicide from 1997, a former costume designer found dead in her apartment, surrounded by film strips arranged in a pattern. When Velasquez heard about the possible connection, she immediately requested both case files. The 1997 victim, Eleanor Martinez, had worked in the industry during the same period as Thomas Harrington. More significantly, both crime scenes featured similar charcoal symbols, though no one had connected them at the time. "They're not identical, but they're clearly related," Velasquez told her former partner Reeves, now a detective sergeant, as they reviewed the files together. "Same distinctive loops in the design, same spacing. This isn't coincidence." They began quietly reopening aspects of both cases, conducting research in their spare time. The department, still focused on current caseloads, provided minimal support, but the digital database allowed them to search for other unsolved homicides with similar characteristics. By 2006, they had identified 3 more cases spanning from 1995 to 2001, all victims with connections to the film industry, all crime scenes featuring some form of theatrical staging. None had been connected at the time they occurred, each investigated by different detectives in different divisions. "We're looking at a serial killer who targets film industry people," Reeves said during one of their informal case reviews. "Not high-profile enough to cause a media frenzy, but people connected enough to understand the references he's making." Velasquez nodded, studying the victim profiles. All were past their prime: a costume designer who hadn't worked in years, an assistant director who dropped out of the industry, a set decorator turned antique dealer, a film critic who lost his column, and a lighting technician who became homeless. People on the fringes, forgotten by an industry they once belonged to. Their theory began to take shape. Someone was targeting industry professionals who had fallen from grace, staging their deaths in ways that referenced their work or specific films. But with victims spread across years in different parts of Los Angeles, the pattern had gone undetected until now. In 2007, the Los Angeles Times ran a feature on cold cases being solved through new technologies and archive digitization. Velasquez, now heading a special cold case unit, used the opportunity to publicly connect the 5 cases for the first time. The article featured photos of the charcoal symbols, asking readers to come forward with information. The response was minimal, but one email caught Velasquez's attention. A film archivist at UCLA wrote that the symbols resembled notations used by an experimental filmmaker named Vincent Crane in the 1970s, a system he had developed to annotate emotional beats in his screenplays. Crane had been a controversial figure whose provocative films had earned both critical acclaim and censorship battles before he disappeared from public life in the early 1980s. When Velasquez and Reeves researched Crane's background, they discovered he had worked with 3 of the 5 victims in various capacities. More significantly, his final unfinished project, Memento Mori, had reportedly been about artists facing their mortality through their work, a film abandoned when its funding was pulled after negative press from a critic who, they now realized, was one of the victims. "This is it," Velasquez said, the excitement in her voice palpable. Crane didn't just know these people, they were all connected to his downfall in some way. The critic who panned him, crew members who moved on to other projects, people who he might have seen as betraying his vision. But Vincent Crane himself had seemingly vanished decades ago. No death certificate existed, no recent records could be found. If he was their killer, he had been operating undetected for years, staging elaborate murders as a form of artistic revenge. The case took on new urgency when they learned that several people connected to Crane's final project were still alive and living in Los Angeles. Were they potential targets? Velasquez arranged protection for those they could locate, while the search for Crane intensified. Library records, property databases, tax filings, they searched everything for traces of the filmmaker. Finally, a breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. A small independent theater in Silver Lake was hosting a Lost Films Festival, featuring rare screenings of obscure works, including a recently discovered short film attributed to Crane but released under a pseudonym in 1990. Velasquez and Reeves attended the screening, scanning the audience for anyone who might fit the profile of their suspect. The film itself was disturbing, a 13-minute piece showing a man arranging photographs in concentric circles while a voiceover discussed the immortality of images versus the mortality of their creators. After the screening, Velasquez approached the festival organizer, a young film enthusiast named David Chen. "How did you find this film?" she asked. "It's been considered lost for decades." Chen explained that he had received it anonymously, a package containing the film and a note suggesting it be included in the festival. "The sender seemed to know exactly when we were planning this event," he said. "The package arrived just 3 weeks ago." Examining the packaging, they found it had been mailed from a post office in Echo Park, the same neighborhood where the Starlight Theater had stood. This was no coincidence. Their killer was still active, still in Los Angeles, and still orchestrating his artistic vision. The discovery of the anonymously sent film reel ignited a new fire in Detective Velasquez. After 8 years, the Starlight Theater case was no longer just a haunting memory, it was an active investigation again. In January 2008, she assembled a small task force dedicated to tracking down Vincent Crane and connecting the 5 murders they now believed were his work. "Our suspect has been hiding in plain sight for decades," Velasquez told her team during their first briefing. "He's patient, methodical, and sees these killings as artistic statements. We need to think like film historians as much as detectives." The task force set up in a conference room at the precinct, walls covered with timelines, victim photos, and film stills from Crane's known works. They created a comprehensive database of everyone who had worked with Crane in the 1970s and early 80s, cross-referencing it with industry professionals still living in Los Angeles. The list of potential targets was disturbingly long. Detective Sam Powell, a former film school student before joining the force, provided valuable insight into Crane's obscure filmography. "His work was always about blurring reality and fiction," Powell explained, pointing to film stills. "He believed that the most powerful art should feel like real life, and real life should be elevated to art." The murders mimic this philosophy, death staged as cinema. The package containing the lost film provided their first tangible lead in years. Forensic analysis found partial fingerprints on the inner packaging that didn't match any of the handlers at the film festival. When run through expanded databases, they matched prints found at the Starlight Theater crime scene, not on the body or the prominent evidence, but on a doorframe, missed in the initial investigation. "He was there, watching us work," Velasquez realized. "Maybe he's been at each scene, observing how we interpret his art." The UCLA film archivist who had identified Crane's notations introduced them to Elaine Mercer, a film historian who had once interviewed Crane for her dissertation on experimental cinema in the 1970s. Now in her 70s, Mercer received the detectives in her book-lined Westwood apartment, framed film posters covering nearly every wall. "Vincent was brilliant but deeply troubled," she told them, her fingers tracing the edge of an old interview transcript. "He saw himself as a prophet of cinema, someone who would transform the medium. When the industry rejected his vision, something broke in him." She described how Crane had become increasingly paranoid after his final project lost funding, claiming he was being deliberately erased from film history by critics and former collaborators. "He told me once that when people tried to erase you, you had to write yourself back into existence with a signature so bold no one could ignore it." "Did he ever mention specific people he felt betrayed by?" Velasquez asked. Mercer nodded slowly. "He kept what he called his credits list, people he believed had sabotaged his career. He was particularly fixated on Richard Keene, the critic who panned his work." Richard Keene, the third victim, found in 2000 surrounded by his negative reviews, poison like the others. "Would you recognize Crane today?" Reeves asked. "We have reason to believe he's still in Los Angeles." Mercer laughed softly. "Vincent would be in his 70s now, if he's alive. But he was already a master of disguise even back then. He studied makeup and prosthetics for his films, could transform actors completely. He used to joke that he could walk past his own mother and she wouldn't know him." This revelation complicated their search enormously. If Crane could alter his appearance convincingly, traditional methods like circulating photos or staking out locations became far less effective. They needed to understand his psychology, predict where he might go next. Mercer provided one crucial piece of information before they left. Vincent was obsessed with cinematic symmetry, beginnings that mirror endings, cycles that complete themselves. If he's creating some grand artistic statement with these murders, he'll want to finish with something spectacular that connects back to how it began. The task force refocused their investigation on Crane's early career and the origins of his downfall. Powell discovered that before his experimental phase, Crane had worked as a projectionist at the old Rialto Theater in Silver Lake, not far from the Starlight where the first victim in their series had been found. The Rialto, unlike the Starlight, hadn't been demolished. It stood abandoned but intact, its Art Deco facade crumbling, marquee long dark. If Crane was planning a symmetrical conclusion to his work, it seemed a likely location. In February 2008, surveillance teams began monitoring the Rialto discreetly. They installed hidden cameras, motion sensors, and regularly rotated plainclothes officers in the vicinity. Weeks passed with no unusual activity. The task force began to wonder if they had misinterpreted Crane's intentions. Then, in early March, one of the motion sensors inside the theater triggered at 3:17 a.m. Security footage showed a figure moving through the lobby, face obscured by a hat and high collar. The night patrol responded immediately but found no one inside, just a single film canister placed precisely in the center of the dusty concession stand, sealed with the same distinctive wax as the one found with the first victim. Inside was another film reel, this one containing a short sequence of empty theater seats, followed by text that read, "The audience awaits the final screening. Summer solstice, 2008. He's planning something for June 20th, Velasquez told her team the next morning. And he wanted us to find this. He's inviting us to the finale." The discovery energized the investigation. They had a deadline and likely location, but still no clear identity for their suspect. If Crane had been living under an alias for decades, traditional searches would prove fruitless. They needed to approach the case differently. Powell suggested a new angle. What if we look at film restoration projects involving Crane's work? His ego wouldn't let him stay completely disconnected from his art. He'd want to know if anyone was preserving his legacy. This approach yielded an unexpected lead. A small preservation society dedicated to experimental cinema had received anonymous donations earmarked specifically for restoring Crane's films. The donations came through a lawyer who maintained client confidentiality, but financial records showed the funds originated from a foundation called Memento Mori Arts, named after Crane's unfinished final project. The foundation, established in 2001, funded various obscure film preservation efforts across the country. Its paperwork listed a board of directors, but when investigators tracked them down, they discovered most were elderly industry professionals who had minimal involvement with the foundation's activities. They had been invited to lend their names for legitimacy, while administrative control remained with the founding director, listed simply as V.M. Crane. He created a legitimate foundation to preserve his own work, Reeves marveled. Hiding in plain sight while building his legacy. The foundation's mailing address was a post office box in Echo Park, but its financial records led to a small accounting firm in Silver Lake that handled its transactions. When detectives visited, they found a modest office managed by a single accountant, Marcus Phillips, who had handled the foundation's finances for over 7 years. Phillips appeared genuinely surprised when questioned about the foundation. "I've never met Mr. Crane in person," he explained. "All our communications have been through email or his assistant who drops off and picks up documents." "Assistant?" Velasquez asked sharply. "What's their name?" "She calls herself Cynthia," Phillips replied. "Comes by every month or so, always very professional. I assumed she worked for several of my clients." When shown photos of the 5 murder victims, Phillips didn't recognize any of them. But security footage from the accounting office revealed the assistant was a woman in her 30s with dark hair, always wearing large sunglasses in business attire. The same woman appeared in background footage from 2 of the crime scenes, watching from a distance as police worked. She's not just an assistant, Velasquez realized. She's his protege or accomplice. The task force expanded their investigation to identify Cynthia. Facial recognition was hampered by the sunglasses, but her distinctive gait and posture provided enough data for the system to suggest potential matches. One name rose to the top, Cynthia Merrill, a former film studies student who had written her thesis on Vincent Crane's work 10 years earlier. Merrill had no criminal record and maintained a low profile. Her last known employment was at a small film archive, but she had left that position in 2003. Current records showed she rented an apartment in Los Feliz and occasionally taught film appreciation workshops at community centers. Surveillance on Merrill began immediately. Her daily routine appeared normal: shopping, visiting cafes, attending film screenings. Nothing overtly connected her to the murders, but detectives noticed how methodically she avoided security cameras, frequently changed her appearance with wigs and clothing styles, and used cash for most transactions. In late May, with the final screening date approaching, Meryl's behavior changed. She made several visits to the abandoned Rialto, each time carrying small packages inside. Surveillance teams resisted the urge to intervene, concerned that arresting her prematurely might alert Crane and lose their chance to capture him. "We need them both," Velasquez insisted during strategy meetings. "Meryl is the key to finding Crane, but he's the mastermind. We wait and watch." As June 20th neared, the task force prepared for multiple scenarios. The theater was mapped thoroughly, tactical teams rehearsed entry points, and plainclothes officers familiarized themselves with the surrounding blocks. Whatever Crane had planned, they would be ready. 2 days before the solstice, Meryl visited an assisted living facility in Pasadena, staying for 3 hours. When she left, surveillance reported she appeared to be escorting an elderly man who walked with a cane. They drove directly to a storage facility where they retrieved several large cases before heading to the Rialto. Velasquez and her team watched via remote cameras as Meryl and the old man entered the theater. Inside, they began a meticulous process of setting up film equipment, arranging chairs, and positioning lights. The elderly man moved with surprising dexterity once inside, his frail appearance seemingly part of a disguise. "That's him," Velasquez said. "That's Vincent Crane." For hours, they observed the pair working, transforming the derelict theater into what appeared to be a staged set. They brought in a director's chair identical to the one from the Starlight murder, positioned film reels in concentric circles on the stage, and drew the same charcoal symbols that had connected all 5 murders. "He's recreating elements from each killing," Powell noted. "It's a retrospective of his work." The surveillance team detected additional movement. 3 more people entered the theater throughout the day. Each carried film equipment or containers, working under Meryl and Crane's direction. None matched the victims or potential targets they had identified. Who are these people? Reeves wondered. More accomplices? As night fell on June 19th, activity in the theater ceased. Meryl and Crane left separately, while the other 3 individuals remained inside. Tactical teams were poised to move in, but Velasquez held them back. "This isn't just preparation," she said. "It's a rehearsal. The real event is tomorrow night." We wait. On the morning of the solstice, June 20th, 2008, Meryl returned to the Rialto carrying what appeared to be food and supplies for those inside. Crane arrived an hour later, no longer disguised as an elderly man but wearing the clothing of a film director, black turtleneck, beret, and distinctive round glasses that matched his appearance from the 1970s. At 74, his face was deeply lined, but his movements were precise and deliberate. Throughout the day, more people arrived at the theater, not collaborators, but what appeared to be invited guests. Well-dressed individuals, many elderly, entered through the side door where Meryl greeted them. By evening, surveillance estimated approximately 30 people were inside. "It's not just a murder he's planning," Velasquez realized with growing alarm. "It's a performance with an audience." At 8 p.m., with the summer sun still lighting the horizon, Velasquez gave the order. Tactical teams moved in silently, securing exits first, then entering through multiple points simultaneously. The main theater doors were breached, officers flooding in with weapons raised, expecting resistance. Instead, they found a scene of bizarre tranquility. The theater had been immaculately restored for one night, seats cleaned, projector running, audience seated as if attending a premiere. On stage stood Vincent Crane, arms outstretched in welcome as the officers entered. "You're right on time," he called out, seeming genuinely pleased. The final act can't begin without its most important viewers. The audience, startled by the police entrance, remained seated. Among them, detectives recognized film archivists, critics, and elderly industry professionals, many connected to experimental cinema of the 1970s. None appeared to be hostages, they had come willingly. Velasquez approached the stage, weapon drawn. "Vincent Crane, you're under arrest for the murders of Thomas Harrington, Eleanor Martinez, Richard Keene, Sofia Valdez, and James Miller." Crane smiled, unperturbed. "Ah, Detective Velasquez. You recognize my work. I've watched you pursue it for years, the only one who truly saw the connections, the artistic statement I was making. Those people weren't art, she responded coldly. They were human beings you murdered. I elevated them, Crane countered. In life, they were forgotten, discarded by an industry that uses talent then throws it away. In death, they became immortal, parts of a greater work that will never be forgotten. As officers moved to apprehend him, Crane made no attempt to flee. Cynthia Merrill, standing at the back of the theater, similarly submitted to arrest without resistance. The audience, now understanding they had been invited to witness the culmination of a serial killer's work, reacted with horror and confusion. The performers who had helped prepare the theater were revealed to be film students who believed they were participating in an underground art installation. They had no knowledge of Crane's crimes or true identity, having been recruited by Merrill through film school connections. As Crane was led away in handcuffs, he turned to Velasquez with an unsettling serenity. You've become part of the narrative too, detective. Your pursuit, your dedication, it's all part of the film now. The audience will remember. The audience members were detained for questioning, though none appeared complicit in the crimes. They had received elegant invitations promising a once-in-a-lifetime restoration screening of lost works by Vincent Crane, with no indication of the true nature of the event. At the precinct, Crane waived his right to an attorney, eager to explain his artistic vision to investigators. In the interrogation room, cameras recording, he spoke for hours with the animated passion of a director explaining his masterpiece. Each death was a scene, meticulously composed, he explained without remorse. Harrington, who abandoned my final project for commercial work, positioned in the director's chair he coveted but never deserved. Martinez, who revealed production secrets to the press, surrounded by the film strips that were her undoing. He described each murder with precision, explaining the symbolism of every element, the meaning behind each location. The poison, digitalis, had been chosen for its historical use in Old Hollywood, where directors would give actors courage drops before difficult scenes. And tonight was to be my masterpiece, he continued. The audience watching a film composed of life and death, while police, the ultimate critics, arrived to deliver the final review. Merrill, interviewed separately, proved more pragmatic than her mentor. She had discovered Crane living in obscurity in the early 2000s and become fascinated by his unfinished work. He was a genius whose vision was interrupted, she told detectives. I wanted to help him complete what he started, to secure his legacy. She admitted to helping plan and execute the final 3 murders, seeing them as necessary components of Crane's grand artistic statement. Her devotion to his vision had overridden any moral concerns about taking lives. As evidence was catalogued, investigators discovered detailed journals, photographs, and film footage documenting each murder. Crane had recorded everything: planning, execution, and police response. Integrating it all into what he called his life's work. The storage facility where Merrill and Crane had retrieved equipment contained an elaborate editing bay where he had been assembling footage from all 5 murders, combined with historical clips of his legitimate film career and documentation of Velasquez's investigation. He was making a documentary about his own crimes and our pursuit, Powell realized as they reviewed the material. Using us as unwitting actors in his narrative. The case that had haunted Maria Velasquez for 9 years concluded with Vincent Crane and Cynthia Merrill charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Additional charges of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice ensured they would never know freedom again. Yet even in custody, Crane maintained the serene satisfaction of an artist who had completed his vision. During a pre-trial psychiatric evaluation, he told the doctor, "My final film is complete, you're watching the last reel unfold right now in this very room." For Detective Velasquez, the capture brought closure but also troubling questions about art, obsession, and how thoroughly a person could justify horror through a distorted creative lens. At the press conference announcing the arrests, a reporter asked how she had persisted through 9 years when others had given up. These victims were treated as props in someone else's story, she answered. I wanted to make sure they were remembered as people first. Everyone deserves that dignity, even after death. The abandoned Rialto Theater was finally demolished later that year, the site eventually becoming a community garden tended by volunteers from the neighborhood. Among them was a former homeless man who had known Thomas the Professor Harrington, the first victim. He planted foxglove at the garden's edge, the source of the poison that had killed his friend, but in this context, transformed into a memorial that bloomed each summer. The case became legendary within the LAPD, taught to new detectives as an example of how patience, perspective, and unconventional thinking could solve seemingly impossible cases. The filmmaker murders, as they came to be known in criminology texts, illustrated how thoroughly a killer could hide within plain sight when operating outside traditional criminal patterns and motivations. For Velasquez, the conclusion brought professional recognition but also a profound weariness. She had spent nearly a decade pursuing shadows through forgotten theaters and film archives. The case had consumed her, shaped her career, and ultimately vindicated her persistence. Yet the price had been high, relationships neglected, opportunities passed, normal life suspended in pursuit of justice. In the aftermath, she requested a temporary leave from the department, needing space to process all that had transpired. She traveled to New York, visiting the Museum of Modern Art where, ironically, a legitimate retrospective of experimental cinema included early works by Vincent Crane, created before his descent into murderous art. Standing before a screen showing flickering images from a more innocent time, Velasquez considered the thin line between obsession and dedication, between artistic vision and madness. Her pursuit of Crane had required its own kind of obsession, a willingness to see patterns where others saw coincidence, to follow intuition when evidence was sparse. When she returned to Los Angeles, she brought a new perspective to her work. The cold case unit she now headed approached investigations with methodical creativity, recognizing that some criminals operated by logics all their own. Her team became known for solving cases others had abandoned, for finding connections in seemingly random events. In June 2009, on the first anniversary of Crane's capture, Velasquez visited the community garden that had replaced the Rialto Theater. The foxglove was in bloom, purple flowers reaching skyward. A small plaque had been installed, listing the names of all 5 victims, ensuring they would be remembered not as props in a killer's production, but as people whose lives had been cut short. As she placed a small stone on the plaque, a tradition borrowed from Jewish custom, a mark that someone had visited and remembered, Velasquez reflected on the case that had defined her career. Vincent Crane had sought immortality through his crimes, believing that art transcended morality. But true justice had come through restoring humanity to his victims, insisting on their dignity even in death. The sun was setting as she left the garden, casting long shadows across the blooming plants. In a city built on stories and illusions, she had spent 9 years separating truth from performance, reality from staging. The case was closed, the killer captured, but its lessons continued to inform her work. Evil could disguise itself as art, obsession as passion, manipulation as vision. Seeing through such disguises required both dedication and wisdom, qualities she had earned through years of patient pursuit. The filmmaker murders were now part of criminal history, but for Maria Velasquez, they represented something more personal, the case that taught her that justice, like truth, often reveals itself slowly, requiring those who seek it to play the long game, to persist when others walk away, and to believe that even the coldest cases can eventually yield to determined heat. The trial of Vincent Crane and Cynthia Merrill began in February 2010, drawing unprecedented media attention. The Los Angeles County Courthouse became a theater of its own, with journalists, film students, and curious onlookers filling every seat. The case had captivated public imagination, a forgotten filmmaker turned serial killer who staged murders as cinematic set pieces, and his devoted protege who helped bring his dark vision to life. District Attorney Eleanor Ramirez led the prosecution, a veteran prosecutor known for her methodical approach and unshakable composure. She stood before the jury on opening day, her voice measured but forceful. "This is not a case about art," she began. "This is a case about 5 human beings whose lives were violently taken by 2 individuals who believed their artistic vision justified murder. The defense will try to blur the lines between art and crime, between genius and madness. But those lines are clear, and we will prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants crossed them deliberately, repeatedly, and without remorse. The defense strategy was as unconventional as the crimes themselves. Crane had insisted on representing himself, with a court-appointed attorney present only as advisory counsel. Merrill, however, had secured prominent defense attorney Robert Chen, known for handling high-profile cases involving the entertainment industry. Crane approached his defense as if directing his final film. He wore a black turtleneck each day, hair carefully styled to evoke his appearance from the 1970s. When he addressed the court, he spoke with the measured cadence of a filmmaker discussing his craft. "What you are witnessing," he told the jury in his opening statement, "is not a murder trial but the final phase of a 30-year artistic journey." These deaths were transformations, elevating forgotten industry workers from obscurity into immortal symbols. They were willing participants in a larger narrative about art, memory, and legacy. The prosecution's first witnesses were the detectives who had investigated each murder, starting with the officers who had responded to the Starlight Theater in 1999. They described the elaborate staging of Thomas Harrington's body, the careful arrangement of newspaper clippings, the director's chair position center stage. Lieutenant Maria Velasquez testified for 3 consecutive days, walking the jury through her 9-year pursuit of the case. Her testimony was compelling, a detective who had refused to let the case go cold, who had seen connections others missed, who had pursued justice when many had forgotten the victims entirely. Each crime scene was meticulously arranged, she explained, referring to crime scene photos displayed on large screens. The positioning, the props, the symbolism, all deliberately chosen to reference the victim's connection to the film industry. These weren't random killings, they were calculated performances designed for an audience. When asked who she believed that audience was, Velasquez looked directly at Crane. "Initially, I thought the killer was performing for the police or the public. But as the investigation progressed, I realized he was performing primarily for himself, creating a body of work he considered his masterpiece." During cross-examination, Crane approached the witness stand with the confidence of a director addressing an actor. "Lieutenant Velasquez, would you say you became obsessed with solving these cases?" "I was committed to finding justice for the victims," she responded evenly. "But it consumed you, did it not? You pursued these cases long after your department had moved on. You made copies of case files to study at home. You attended film festivals looking for connections. That sounds like obsession to me." "I call it dedication," Velasquez countered. "And it led to your arrest." Crane smiled. "Indeed it did. And in that pursuit, did you not find yourself transformed? Did this case not become the defining narrative of your career?" The prosecutor objected, but the point had been made. Crane was suggesting that Velasquez, too, had been drawn into his artistic vision, becoming an unwitting collaborator in his narrative. The most damning testimony came from the medical examiner, Dr. Leila Patel, who detailed how each victim had died from the same poison, digitalis, administered in nearly identical doses. The consistency proved premeditation and method, undermining any defense claims of accidental or impulsive actions. The poison was administered while the victims were alive, Dr. Patel testified. Based on the stomach contents and tissue absorption, they would have experienced symptoms for hours before death: disorientation, visual disturbances, cardiac arrhythmia, and significant pain. Throughout this testimony, Crane sat impassively, occasionally making notes. Merrill, however, visibly reacted, her composure cracking as the clinical details of suffering were laid bare. When the prosecution presented the physical evidence, the film canisters, the charcoal symbols, the newspaper clippings found at each scene, they built an irrefutable connection between all 5 murders. Forensic analysts demonstrated how the handwriting on notes matched Crane's, how fibers from his clothing had been found at multiple scenes, how the distinctive wax seals contained his fingerprints. The most powerful moments came when the prosecution called witnesses who had known the victims. A shelter volunteer described Thomas the Professor Harrington as kind and intelligent despite his circumstances, often helping other homeless individuals navigate social services. A former colleague spoke of Eleanor Martinez's talent for costume design and her struggles to remain relevant in a changing industry. Richard Keene's daughter described her father's passion for film criticism and his devotion to his family. These were real people, the prosecutor emphasized after each testimony. Not characters in a film, not symbols or props, but human beings with families, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. As the prosecution case neared its conclusion, they presented their most powerful evidence, the extensive documentation found in Crane's storage facility. Journals detailed his planning for each murder, photographs tracked the victims for weeks before their deaths, and most disturbing, video footage showed Crane and Merrill arranging the bodies after death, positioning them with the cold precision of film set decorators. This, Prosecutor Ramirez told the jury, holding up one of the journals, is the mind of a killer who believed his artistic vision justified murder. This is not genius. This is not misunderstood creativity. This is calculated, premeditated evil disguised as art. When the defense phase began, Crane's strategy became clear. He called film historians, critics, and former collaborators to testify about his early career and the artistic significance of his legitimate work. He built a narrative of himself as a visionary artist silenced by commercial interests and vindictive critics. My client's work was revolutionary, his advisory council argued. His experimental approaches to narrative and visual composition challenged conventions and threatened established powers in the industry. When his funding was cut, when his voice was silenced, he sought other means of artistic expression. Merrill's defense took a different approach. Her attorney portrayed her as a vulnerable student manipulated by a charismatic mentor, drawn into his delusions through admiration that had been twisted into unhealthy devotion. Ms. Merrill was barely 25 when she first contacted Mr. Crane, Chin told the court. She was impressionable, isolated, and desperate for recognition in an industry known for exploiting young talent. She became entangled in his distorted reality until she could no longer distinguish between artistic expression and criminal acts. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Crane took the stand in his own defense. For 3 days, he testified without notes, describing his artistic philosophy, his fall from industry favor, and what he called his evolution beyond traditional cinema. Traditional film is trapped in 2 dimensions, he explained with unsettling passion. It can only represent reality. I sought to create art that was reality, where life and death were not simulated but actual, where the audience's emotion wasn't manipulated through fiction but generated through truth. The prosecutor's cross-examination was surgical. Mr. Crane, you've spoken at length about your artistic vision, but I'd like to focus on some specific facts. Did you administer poison to Thomas Harrington in October 1999? I facilitated his transformation from forgotten homeless man to a moral artistic statement. That's not the question. Did you poison him? I elevated him. By killing him? After a long pause, Crane smiled slightly. By releasing him from an industry that had discarded him. And the others? Did you elevate Eleanor Martinez? Richard Keene? Sofia Valdez? James Miller? Each became part of something greater than themselves. By dying at your hands? By becoming essential components of the most significant work of experimental cinema ever created. The prosecutor approached the witness stand. Mr. Crane, regardless of how you frame it, did you knowingly and intentionally cause the deaths of these 5 individuals? Crane looked directly at the jury. I am an artist. These deaths were my medium. History will understand what this court cannot. The courtroom fell silent. In that moment, any sympathy the jury might have felt for Crane's artistic claims evaporated. His own words had confirmed what the prosecution had argued all along, that he valued his art above human life. Cynthia Merrill also testified, her demeanor starkly different from Crane's confident performance. She appeared diminished, her voice soft, eyes often downcast. She described meeting Crane, being drawn into his world, gradually losing perspective as she helped plan and execute the later murders. I believed in his vision, she testified, tears streaming down her face. I thought we were creating something revolutionary. I told myself these people would be remembered forever, not forgotten as they had been in life. But now I see the truth, we didn't elevate them. We stole everything from them. Her apparent remorse created a stark contrast with Crane's philosophical justifications, a contrast her attorney emphasized in closing arguments. One defendant sits before you proud of his crimes, the other horrified by her participation. One created this nightmare, the other was drawn into it. As the trial entered its final week, the courthouse was packed each day, the hallways filled with film students debating artistic ethics, reporters filing hourly updates, and family members of victims seeking closure. Vincent Crane had achieved the audience he sought, not through his films, but through his crimes and their legal aftermath. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to their fundamental position. Art does not justify murder, Ramirez told the jury. Creativity does not excuse cruelty. Vision does not vindicate violence. The defendants may call their actions art, but the law calls them what they truly are, first-degree murder, 5 times over. Crane's advisory counsel emphasized his client's brilliant but troubled mind, suggesting diminished capacity due to psychological issues stemming from his professional rejection decades earlier. Merrill's attorney pleaded for leniency based on her cooperation and remorse, portraying her as a victim of Crane's manipulation. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom hushed as the foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand. On the charge of first-degree murder of Thomas Harrington, we find the defendant Vincent Crane guilty. One by one, the verdicts came: guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder for Crane, guilty on 3 counts for Merrill. The additional charges of conspiracy and evidence tampering brought the total to a devastating list of convictions. When the judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, Merrill spoke first, her voice barely audible. "I cannot undo what I've done, but I am haunted every day by the lives we took. I mistook destruction for creation, death for art. I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I could have been so wrong." When Crane's turn came, he stood with theatrical dignity. "Your Honor, this court has convicted an artist for his most significant work. Future generations will view this trial as they now view the censorship of great artists throughout history, as a failure to recognize revolutionary vision. My work will outlive this verdict." The judge, unmoved, sentenced Vincent Crane to 5 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Cynthia Merrill received 45 years with possibility of parole after 30, acknowledgement of her cooperation and apparent remorse. As Crane was led from the courtroom, he turned toward Lieutenant Velasquez sitting in the front row. "You were my best audience," he said with a slight smile. "The only one who truly understood the complete narrative." Velasquez didn't respond, watching silently as the door closed behind him. In the aftermath of the trial, the case continued to reverberate through Los Angeles and the film community. Academic papers analyzed the intersection of art and ethics, film schools developed courses examining the case, and true crime documentaries retraced the murders and investigation in meticulous detail. For the victims' families, however, the sensationalism was painful. They had watched their loved ones reduced to symbolic roles in Crane's narrative, their individuality overshadowed by the killer's artistic pretensions. To counter this, they established a foundation dedicated to preserving the true legacies of the 5 victims, focusing on their lives and contributions rather than their deaths. The Thomas Harrington Fund provided resources for homeless individuals with connections to the arts. The Eleanor Martinez Scholarship supported costume design students from underprivileged backgrounds. Each initiative sought to reclaim the victims' identities from the grotesque narrative Crane had imposed on them. Lieutenant Maria Velasquez found herself in an unexpected position, sought after for interviews, lectures, and consulting work. The case had made her a reluctant celebrity in law enforcement circles, her methodical 9-year pursuit held up as a model of investigative persistence. In October 2011, on the anniversary of the first murder, Velasquez published an article in the Los Angeles Times, not about the investigation or Crane's motives, but about the 5 victims and how society had failed them before their deaths. Before they became victims, they were individuals struggling in an industry that values youth and success above experience and humanity, she wrote. They had been forgotten while alive, by an industry they served, by a society that walked past them. Perhaps the most important lesson from this case is not about a killer's twisted vision, but about our collective failure to value each life equally, regardless of status or circumstance. The article sparked discussions about how the entertainment industry treated aging talent, how easily people could slip from relevance into invisibility. Industry leaders, facing public pressure, established support programs for crew members and artists whose careers had stalled or ended. 6 months after the trial concluded, Velasquez received an unexpected letter. The return address was the California Institution for Women, where Cynthia Merrill was serving her sentence. She hesitated before opening it, uncertain what Crane's accomplice could possibly say that would matter. The letter was brief but striking. "Lieutenant Velasquez," it began, "I'm writing not to seek forgiveness, which I don't deserve, but to share something I believe you should know. Vincent never saw himself as a killer, but as a director casting actors in their final roles. What haunts me now is the realization that I wasn't his protege, I was just another actor in his production. The difference is that my role continues. While researching his past for my thesis, I discovered evidence of other deaths, similar staging, similar victims, dating back to the 1980s. I've enclosed what I know. There may be other families waiting for the closure you helped provide to 5. The enclosure detailed 3 additional suspected murders across different states, each involving former film industry workers, each with elements that resembled Crane's signature staging. If true, his artistic career had begun. Much earlier than they had realized. Velasquez brought the letter to her department, and a new investigation was launched. Working with authorities in Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, they identified cold cases matching Merrill's information. Evidence was re-examined, witnesses re-interviewed, and DNA samples from preserved evidence compared to Crane's profile. By early 2012, they had confirmed Crane's connection to 2 additional murders, a former script supervisor found arranged in a tableau in Reno in 1988, and a film editor discovered in a similar staging in Portland in 1992. The third case remained inconclusive but suspicious. These revelations meant reopening wounds for some families but provided long-awaited answers for others. For Velasquez, it meant the case that had defined her career was still unfolding, the true extent of Crane's crimes potentially greater than anyone had imagined. In prison, Vincent Crane maintained his artistic pretensions, writing manifestos about his cinematic revolution and attempting to direct other inmates in theatrical productions. Prison authorities eventually restricted his activities after discovering he was documenting and photographing conflicts between inmates, treating prison violence as another form of performance art. Cynthia Merrill took a different path. She pursued education opportunities in prison, eventually earning a degree in psychology. She volunteered for restorative justice programs, meeting with victims' advocates to understand the full impact of her crimes. Her cooperation in identifying additional victims led to sentence reductions, though she would remain incarcerated for at least 25 years. The film industry, initially defensive about connections to the case, gradually embraced reform. The Starlight Initiative established support systems for aging industry professionals, while film schools incorporated ethics courses addressing the boundaries between art and exploitation. The abandoned Rialto Theater, where the final confrontation had occurred, was ultimately restored as a community arts center with programs specifically supporting disadvantaged youth interested in filmmaking. 10 years after the discovery of Thomas Harrington's body at the Starlight Theater, Lieutenant Velasquez, now Captain Velasquez, stood at a podium in the community garden that had replaced the demolished building. Before her was a gathered crowd of victims' family members, officers who had worked the case, and community members. A decade ago, she began, this place was the scene of a tragedy that revealed how easily people can become invisible in a city built on visibility, how those who fall from the spotlight can slip into shadows where predators wait. Today, we dedicate this space not just to the memory of those lost, but to the principle that every life has inherent value beyond utility, beyond success, beyond recognition. She unveiled a simple stone monument bearing the names of all 7 confirmed victims, along with the inscription, "Remembered not for how they died, but for who they were. May their true stories endure." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, a young film student approached Velasquez hesitantly. "Captain," she said, "I'm doing my thesis on this case, not on Crane, but on how you never gave up, how you connected the dots when no one else could. Would you be willing to talk about your process?" Velasquez studied the young woman thoughtfully. "What's your focus exactly?" "How conventional investigation methods failed, and how thinking outside traditional frameworks ultimately solved the case. I believe there are lessons here for how we approach complex problems beyond criminal justice." "Walk with me," Velasquez said, gesturing toward the garden paths. As they walked among flowering plants that had replaced decay and abandonment, she shared insights rarely captured in official reports or media coverage. The key wasn't just persistence, she explained. It was learning to see the case through different lenses, not just as a detective, but as a historian, a film scholar, an audience member. Crane created his murders as a form of communication. To catch him, we had to understand what he was trying to say and to whom. The student took notes eagerly. "So empathy was actually your investigative tool?" "Not empathy with the killer, but with his worldview. Understanding without accepting. Seeing patterns from his perspective without adopting his values." Velasquez paused beside a bench. "That's the balance that matters in any difficult pursuit, maintaining your moral center while expanding your perspective." As evening approached, Velasquez remained in the garden alone, watching shadows lengthen across the memorial stone. The case had transformed her, from a young detective into a department leader, from an investigator into something of a philosopher. She had glimpsed the darkest possibilities of human creativity perverted toward destruction, yet emerged with deeper commitment to protecting the vulnerable and forgotten. The filmmaker murders had been solved, but their echoes continued, in reformed industry practices, in cold cases reopened nationwide, in criminology textbooks studying the intersection of art and violence, and in the lives of families still healing from losses that had become public spectacle. For Maria Velasquez, the case represented both her greatest professional achievement and a profound personal journey. She had pursued justice through 9 years of dead ends and false starts, through institutional indifference and public skepticism. Her persistence had given voice to victims who might otherwise have remained footnotes in a killer's twisted narrative. As darkness fell over Los Angeles, lights illuminated the garden paths. Velasquez touched the memorial stone once more before leaving, her fingers tracing names now familiar as family. Behind her, the garden, once a place of death and macabre theater, bloomed with renewed life, a testament to how thoroughly darkness could be transformed through dedication, time, and unfaltering commitment to truth. The legacy of the filmmaker murders would always remain complex, a case that exposed the shadow side of artistic obsession while illuminating the power of methodical pursuit of justice. But for those who had lived through it, both investigators and survivors, its ultimate lesson was simpler: no life is disposable, no person merely a prop, and no artistic vision justifies the deliberate extinguishing of human potential. In that understanding lay both wisdom and healing, a counter-narrative powerful enough to outlast even the most calculated performance of evil. 15 years after the conclusion of the filmmaker murders case, Los Angeles had changed. The old Starlight Theater was a distant memory, its site now home to a thriving community arts center. The Rialto, once abandoned and decaying, had been restored to its former glory, hosting independent films and student productions. The city's relationship with its artistic past had evolved, more conscious of both preserving legacy and protecting those who created it. Captain Maria Velasquez, now approaching retirement from the LAPD, sat at her desk reviewing the department's cold case statistics. Under her leadership, the cold case unit had become one of the most successful in the country, with a solve rate that exceeded national averages by nearly 15%. The methodologies she had developed during the filmmaker murders investigation had been adopted by departments nationwide. Her phone rang, a call from the California Institution for Women. "Captain Velasquez," the voice on the line said, this is Warden Torres. I'm calling about Cynthia Merrill. Velasquez tensed. Merrill, now in her 50s, had served 15 years of her sentence, becoming a model prisoner who counseled younger inmates and contributed to restorative justice programs. Her parole hearing was scheduled for the following month. There's been an incident, the warden continued. Merrill was attacked by another inmate yesterday. She's in stable condition, but during treatment, they discovered advanced pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The prognosis is terminal, 6 months at most. Velasquez absorbed this information silently, emotions conflicted. Merrill had helped identify Crane's additional victims, had expressed what seemed like genuine remorse, but she had still participated in 3 murders. She's requested to speak with you, the warden added. She claims to have additional information about Crane that she's never shared. Given her condition, we thought you should know. 2 days later, Velasquez sat across from Merrill in the prison infirmary. The years and illness had transformed the once youthful film student into a gaunt woman with prematurely gray hair. Medical equipment beeped softly in the background. "Thank you for coming," Merrill said, her voice thin but clear. "I didn't think you would." "You said you have information about Crane," Velasquez replied, keeping her tone professional. Merrill nodded slowly. "Before he died, Vincent entrusted me with something. He called it his final cut, a storage facility in Bakersfield registered under yet another alias. The key is with my personal effects. I've never told anyone about it until now." "Why tell me after all this time?" "Because I'm dying," Merrill said simply. "And because you're the only one who truly understood the case, not as sensational headlines, but as a fundamental corruption of art into something monstrous." She paused, breathing labored. "Whatever's there, it shouldn't stay buried. The families deserve to know everything." Velasquez studied her, searching for manipulation or deception, but saw only exhaustion and what appeared to be sincere contrition. "What do you think I'll find there?" "I don't know exactly." He called it his Genesis work, said it explained everything that came after. He was already planning his crimes when I met him, but I always sensed there was something earlier, something that transformed him from merely bitter to methodically vengeful. After leaving the prison, Velasquez debated whether to pursue this lead. She was months from retirement, the case officially closed years ago. But the possibility of filling the remaining gaps in the narrative, understanding what had truly set Vincent Crane on his dark path, proved impossible to ignore. With proper authorization, she retrieved the key from Merrill's belongings and drove to Bakersfield the following weekend. The storage facility was small and unremarkable, located on the outskirts of the city. Unit 217 had continued receiving automatic payments from an account Crane had established before his capture, payments so modest they had never triggered any flags. The padlock turned with a rusty click. Inside, Velasquez found not the elaborate editing setup or documentation they'd discovered in his Los Angeles storage unit, but something more personal, furniture and belongings from what appeared to be a home. Family photographs, books, vinyl records, and home movies from the 1970s. In the center stood a wooden desk, meticulously preserved. On it lay a leather-bound journal with a single word embossed on the cover, Inception. Opening it, Velasquez found not the ramblings of a killer, but a coherent narrative dating back to 1978. The early entries revealed a different Vincent Crane, idealistic, passionate about film, newly married to a woman named Sarah who worked as a script supervisor. The journal chronicled their collaboration on an ambitious experimental film called Reflections that had garnered attention at independent festivals. As she read further, the story darkened. A major studio had offered to finance Crane's next project with a substantial budget, but with conditions that would compromise his artistic vision. Against Sarah's advice, he had refused, believing other opportunities would follow. They hadn't. The industry had blacklisted him, viewing his refusal as arrogance. The entries grew increasingly bitter as Crane described watching his contemporaries succeed while he struggled to find funding for even modest projects. Sarah had supported them through her work, believing in his talent, urging patience and persistence. Then came the entry that sent a chill through Velasquez. dated November 1980, it described Sarah being offered a prestigious position on a major production, one directed by a filmmaker who had once promised to back Crane's work but had abandoned him when the studio pressure mounted. Accepted the job today, he wrote. Claims we need the money, that it doesn't mean she's abandoning my vision. But she'll be working for Marcus, helping realize his vision while mine withers. The betrayal is complete. Everyone I trusted has revealed their true character. The next several entries detailed a rapid psychological unraveling, paranoia, rage, and a growing fixation on the concept of artistic justice. Crane described following Sarah to the set, watching her work with the director who had stolen her loyalty. The final entry, dated December 18, 1980, was the most disturbing. Tonight I discovered the true medium for my art. Not celluloid, which can be cut and manipulated after the fact, but life itself, captured in the moment of transformation. Became my first canvas, her betrayal the first scene in what will become my masterwork. The critics called my films bloodless intellectual exercises. No one will ever say that again. The journal ended there, but a newspaper clipping tucked into the back pages filled in the missing pieces. The headline read, "Film Worker's Mysterious Death Ruled Accident." Sarah Crane had been found at the bottom of a ravine near a film location in Northern California, her death attributed to an accidental fall during night shooting. No foul play had been suspected. Velasquez sat back, the journal heavy in her hands. Crane's artistic revolution hadn't begun with Thomas Harrington in 1999 or even with the earlier victims they had identified. It had begun with his wife, almost 20 years before the Starlight Theater murder. The storage unit contained more than just the journal. A box of old film reels sat beneath the desk, carefully preserved. Using her phone, Velasquez recorded the labels. Sarah, Transformation was the first, dated December 1980. The others span the following decades, with gaps of several years between them. Many carried only initials and dates, but Velasquez recognized some that corresponded to cold cases they had investigated. What she had found was Crane's complete archive, not just the murders they had solved, but potentially others that had never been connected to him. This wasn't just evidence, it was a catalog of his entire murderous career, meticulously preserved as he would have preserved his legitimate films. Back in Los Angeles, Velasquez assembled a special task force to process the Bakersfield discovery. Cold case detectives, forensic analysts, and film archivists worked together to document and analyze every item. The home movies and photographs revealed Crane's early life and career, showing a man who had once possessed genuine talent and vision before bitterness warped his perspective. The film reels presented a more disturbing challenge. When carefully transferred to digital format in the forensic lab, they revealed what Crane had called his transformations, recordings of his victims before, during, and after their deaths. Some dated back to the early 1980s, victims no one had connected to him, murders that had been ruled accidents or remained unsolved for decades. We're looking at potentially 15 additional victims beyond the 7 we've confirmed, Velasquez told her team after the initial review. This spans more than 25 years in multiple states. The investigation expanded, connecting with law enforcement agencies across the country. Cold cases were reopened, evidence re-examined with new context. Families who had spent decades wondering about loved ones suddenly faced both the pain of confirmation and the relief of finally knowing the truth. For Velasquez, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Professional satisfaction at solving so many cases was tempered by the knowledge that Crane had operated undetected for so much longer than anyone had realized. The system had failed these victims repeatedly, first when the film industry discarded them as irrelevant, then when their deaths had been misclassified or investigations abandoned. 3 months into the expanded investigation, Velasquez received another call from the women's prison. Cynthia Merrill had taken a turn for the worse and was not expected to survive the week. She had requested a final meeting. This time, Velasquez found Merrill in hospice care, her body frail, voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "Did you find it?" she asked when Velasquez entered. "Yes. We found everything." Sarah was the first, wasn't she? Merrill's eyes, sunken but alert, fixed on Velasquez's face. He never told me her name, just that his artistic awakening began with someone close to him. I suspected, but never knew for certain. Why did you wait so long to reveal the Bakersfield storage unit? Merrill's laugh turned into a painful cough. Fear, at first. Even in prison, I was afraid of his influence, afraid of betraying his trust. Later, it was shame. I knew whatever was there would reveal more victims, more families destroyed. She paused, struggling for breath. And selfishly, I wanted to believe I was special, that our work together was the culmination of his vision, not just another chapter in a longer nightmare. You could have come forward years ago. Those families deserved answers. Yes, Merrill agreed, tears welling. Another failure on my part. I've had 15 years to understand how thoroughly he manipulated me, how I surrendered my own moral compass to his twisted vision. I have no excuses. Velasquez sat silently, the weight of 2 decades of investigation settling between them. The parole board will be informed of your cooperation, she said finally. Though given your condition. I'm not seeking parole. I'll die in this room, which is more peace than our victims had. Merrill turned her face toward the window, where afternoon light cast patterns on the wall. Vincent believed art was immortal, that his work would outlive judgment. He was wrong. What survives isn't his artistic vision but the pain he caused, the lives he destroyed. Before leaving, Velasquez asked the question that had haunted her since finding the journal. Did you ever see genuine remorse in him? Any recognition of the human cost? Merrill considered this, her breathing labored. Once. After the 4th murder, Sofia Valdez, the set designer. He watched the film of her death and whispered, Sarah would be ashamed. It was the only time I ever heard him acknowledge doubt. She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident. But it passed quickly. By morning, he was planning the next scene. Cynthia Merrill died 3 days later, her death barely noted by the media that had once been obsessed with the filmmaker murders. Velasquez attended the small prison service, not out of sympathy but out of a sense that someone should witness the end of this chapter. The chaplain spoke of redemption and forgiveness, concepts that seemed simultaneously essential and inadequate in the face of such profound harm. The expanded investigation continued for another year, eventually confirming 13 additional murders beyond the 7 previously attributed to Crane. In each case, the victim had some connection to the film industry and to Crane's perceived betrayal. Each death had been staged, each transformation documented for his private collection. As Velasquez approached retirement, she focused on ensuring these cases would be properly resolved. She organized a national conference for the victims' families, providing a space for them to connect with each other and with the investigators who had finally uncovered the truth. During the conference, the daughter of one of the earliest victims approached Velasquez. My mother was just a name in a cold case file for 30 years, she said. Now I understand what happened to her, why she never came home. It doesn't erase the pain, but it fills in the void of not knowing. On her final day with the LAPD, Velasquez visited the community arts center built where the Starlight Theater once stood. The garden was in full bloom, the memorial stone now listing all 20 victims identified in the case. Young filmmakers worked in studios built specifically to support independent projects, a living testament to creativity channeled toward positive ends. The center's director, a former student from the film program Velasquez had helped establish, greeted her warmly. Our latest class is graduating next week, she said. We've named this year's achievement award after you. That's not necessary, Velasquez demurred. It absolutely is. Your work didn't just solve murders, it transformed how we think about art and responsibility, about whose stories deserve to be preserved and protected. She gestured toward a classroom where students were editing projects. Every filmmaker here learns not just technique, but ethics. That's your legacy. As the sun set over Los Angeles, Velasquez walked through the garden one last time. 20 names carved in stone, 20 lives cut short by one man's warped artistic vision. Yet around those names, New art flourished, films that honored rather than exploited, stories that connected rather than destroyed. In her career spanning more than 30 years, Velázquez had witnessed humanity at its worst and at its most resilient. The filmmaker murders had shown her the darkest possible corruption of creative impulse, but its resolution had also revealed the healing power of truth pursued without compromise. Vincent Crane had believed his murders would be his artistic legacy, elevating him beyond conventional judgment. Instead, he had become a cautionary tale, his name a shorthand for the dangers of unchecked ego and artistic obsession. The true art that emerged from the case was not his twisted transformations but the patient, methodical pursuit of justice, the careful reconstruction of lives reduced to props, the restoration of dignity to those he had sought to diminish. In retirement, Velázquez agreed to teach an ethics course at the Los Angeles Film Academy, sharing lessons from the case with a new generation of filmmakers. She began each semester with a simple question: what do we owe to those whose stories we tell? The answers evolved over the weeks as students grappled with the case study, eventually reaching the conclusion she hoped for, that true art honors rather than exploits, reveals truth rather than imposes fantasy, and recognizes that no vision, however brilliant, justifies harm. 2 years into retirement, Velázquez published her account of the investigation, The Director's Cut, Inside the Filmmaker Murders. Unlike the sensationalized versions that had preceded it, her book focused on the victims and the investigative process, carefully avoiding the glorification of Crane that other accounts had fallen into. The book became required reading in criminology programs and film schools alike, its central thesis resonating across disciplines, that the line between genius and monstrosity lies not in talent or vision, but in the recognition of others' humanity. On the 25th anniversary of the discovery at the Starlight Theater, a special commemoration was held at the Arts Center. Families of victims gathered alongside investigators, students, and community members. The event featured not a rehashing of the crimes, but a celebration of the lives interrupted, showcasing the legitimate artistic contributions of the victims through restored films, preserved costume designs, and critical writing. Velázquez, now in her 70s, watched as Sarah Crane's early experimental films, lovingly restored from archives, played for a new audience. The work was striking in its humanity and emotional depth, revealing the talent Vincent had first admired, then resented, and finally extinguished. Afterward, Sarah's nephew approached Velázquez. "Thank you for finding the truth," he said. "For decades, our family believed she died in an accident. Now we know her story, tragic as it is. And more importantly, her work lives on, separate from his crimes." That evening, as the commemoration concluded, Velázquez stood in the garden among the memorial stones. Los Angeles spread before her, a city built on stories both real and imagined. The filmmaker murders had revealed the dangerous territory where those categories blurred, where one person's artistic vision became another's nightmare. What remained, after all the investigations and trials and revelations, was not just the solution to a complex case, but a deeper understanding of both art's power and its responsibilities. Vincent Crane had believed he was creating his masterpiece through murder. Instead, he had demonstrated the fundamental emptiness of art divorced from ethics, of vision without compassion. The true masterwork had been the investigation itself, the patient assembly of fragments into a coherent whole, the restoration of identity to those reduced to symbols, the transformation of tragedy into meaning. It had required not just professional skill but moral clarity, the unwavering belief that each victim deserved to be seen as fully human, not merely as material for someone else's narrative. As twilight deepened over the garden, Velázquez placed a stone on the memorial, an act of remembrance repeated by countless visitors over the years. In that simple gesture lay the essence of what the case had taught her, that memory, properly honored, is not about sensationalizing tragedy but about affirming connection, not about exploiting vulnerability but about recognizing shared humanity. The filmmaker murders had begun as one man's distorted artistic statement and concluded as a testament to persistence, to the enduring value of truth sought without compromise, and to the fundamental principle that no story matters more than the lives from which it grows. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.